now we just need some streaks. How we do that? So basically we just gonna copy the sparks, because they're basically doing the motion that we want. And what I mean by streaks is just like I want some fire chunks followed by fire and smoke to fly out, and we just say like, oh, it's going to be, I don't know, 10, 15, or maybe 20. Fine. And just gonna quickly increase the size so we actually see which one they are. We just make them velocity facing, and we're going to remove the Brownian or make it at least less visible so they don't jitter that much. If there's a lot of turbulence, they start to jitter because they're constantly changing direction. There's a material set up. Let's use a glow. We have texture tiling, and it's 2x2. Oops, there was a no, I just pick a random one. Doesn't matter. And we need blending is additive again. So these are just some glowing orbs. They may be too much red because the texture was already red a bit, orangey a bit. And yeah, they have some emissive, that's fine. Can tone down the size again, 0.2. So we have these things. What they do now is, and what sparks also do, they spawn omnidirectional in all directions, and they also go down. I want to make them only go upwards mostly, a bit to the sides as well. What I do is I get rid of omnidirectional, so, and let's just solo them. And now I want them to just shoot upwards, and we had the cone there. You can just copy paste the cone, or you can just add it here with velocity cone. What you can do with the curve, you can have on the angle, well, on the velocity, I don't actually want the curve, so I remove it. And the velocity, I'm just like random. Just pick any velocity, or maybe not 0, but anything between 2 and 10 will do. So we can just do that, and then on the angle. Now I want it to be on a 90-degree angle. So it from its original trajectory, which is z up, it's gonna deflect like 90 degrees to all directions. And if you remove the randomizer, it will be perfectly 90 degrees off z. And you have the randomizer again. Now I want to not only have it random, but I also want to have a bit control of how much random I want. I'm gonna add the curve and remove the random here. And I'm not gonna set the curve to h, but I pick a random number just here, curve, and I pick a random number, and what it gives me a bit chance distribution. So if I set it to linear, the curve, it will behave exactly like random. So it's going to pick a random point here, it's going to give me a random number. But when I actually do something like that, so now the chance is higher that it's going to be something in this flat region. So if I get a random number here, it's going to be some high number. If I get a number here, it's going to be some high number. And now I want it to be shooting mostly up, and mostly up means a low number. So I add mostly low numbers here, and then here I get some high numbers that going to the side. So you see most of them going up, and every now and then something shoots to the side completely. And you can tweak the curve a bit. So this is like you have not only random, you have also chance distribution. Now what we're gonna add is on this. I'm gonna remove this. On these, I'm gonna add second gen on spawn. So every time these spawn, I'm gonna drag this out here. I'm gonna spawn a ribbon, and what the ribbon does is it creates a ribbon. It's straightforward. Can show more ribbon setups, more possible ribbon setups later. Here I'm just gonna quickly go through it and make the lifetime quite short, or like 0.3, and we're not gonna use rate, we're gonna use count, because this is actually how the ribbon works better. We're gonna say like 25 ribbon pieces over well, duration. I can just say no duration, means it will spawn as long as the parent lives and they are following the parent. And can reduce the count a bit, maybe it's too much, 5. You see it gets choppier in the corners and everything. What you can also do is on the render ribbon settings, connect to origin. So the front piece will always go to the part that it's following. And also on the size, when we actually have a curve, so it's actually, you can make it grow, you can make it shrink, so it doesn't just like disappear in the end. But actually we don't want to make it shrink. It's totally fine that it disappears, because we're gonna just ramp down the opacity on the curve over time. So now it just softly blends out. And now the size. What we have here is we have inherit. So size 1 is like 1 meter big, or like the radius of 1, which is like the diameter of 2. So they are quite big. But if you, let me just add this. If you have size 1 and you add as a modifier inherit, what it will do is it will inherit the size of the parent and multiply it by 1, or by any number you type in here. So it could be half the size of the parent, it could be 5 times the size of the parent, it could be anything. So we make it half the size of the parent. And now if we have, like, let's say that the parent is size 1, then the ribbons get automatically bigger as well, and which also does change over time sometimes. And what you can do here on the size inherit, you have the checkbox spawn only, or does it actually scale over time. So if the parent if the parent is animated and the parent gets smaller, should the child become smaller as well, or should it only decide what size is going to be when it's actually spawning? So this is what spawn only does. And spawn only you can find on a lot of modifiers where it's making sense. So on something like where was it? It's usually let me find one. Well, size, if I had a curve here and I just pick the parent here, I only always get, do I want to check only once for the value, or do I want to check for the whole time when the child is living? So yeah, so now the ribbon just needs some texture. Actually, yeah. Okay, we're in solo mode. Okay. Material, and we have some smoke. Gonna add some smoke, and how the texture is applied is also in the ribbon render. Texture frequency, you can make it more frequent. It's basically the unwrapping. There's different spawn things. I will explain it on another opportunity. We can have some. I'm gonna leave it for now like that. What else I'm gonna add is just gonna add some fire. So this is like just some constantly burning fire, but I'm gonna add it to each of the streaks, and what I'm gonna remove is the offsets, and for the offsets I can show later. And we're just gonna make the size a bit smaller, and now we just make this fire and do again the same fire animation texture, and we've learned, but now so okay, and loop. No, not loop. Don't want it to loop. Just want this. And again, blending mode. Just copy it from another one. So I get a bit of fire. It looks like quite not frequent enough. What you can do is just add on the velocity. We're gonna use the inherit, like same as the size. We're gonna inherit the speed of a particle. So if we disable physics here, and we inherit the full speed, then yeah, okay, it's kind of working. It's just not really the result I wanted because it just needs more drag, I guess, and it also needs again some stretching, and also no gravity. It's also probably way too long life. Yeah, so something like that. That's how it looks without them. this is how you have done with. Just too much scale. Yeah, it's just some fire on these things. Not going to tweak it too much. You can do it on your thing. So we're almost there. We have all the individual components. They don't look that awesome now. They need some tweaking, but that's just how you make particles. It just takes some time sometimes. Can't rush through everything. Now what we want to have is a shockwave that's on the floor. So not even if the particle is on the floor, but also if it explodes up here, it should also have a shockwave down there. How we're gonna do that is actually I'm just gonna copy it from the other effect, just because it took some time to set up, but I'm just gonna show you how it's done. So I copied these nodes here, and we're just gonna disable them one by one and hook them up again. You see there is some hierarchy already inside them. I connect this one, and so now this one spawns here. I solo it. It doesn't do anything. It's actually just the parent projection. If you get this one, it's the exact thing. What it does is it projects from here on the terrain. It has a feature here, which is project terrain. It's just going to the position of the terrain, and what it means is wherever your particle exploded, your subcomponent is going to be on the terrain underneath it, and then you can start spawning things like let's say I have a sprite here, which is just a shockwave, and it's just a sprite which has facing mode 3. So it means it's not camera facing, it's just a free sprite, and it's just aligned with the ground because its parent is aligned with the ground. And this sprite is the same thing. It just has a count, duration, it has some time, it grows over time, it has some randomizer here, opacity shrinks over time, and it just has the shockwave texture applied. And there's the physics feature, but actually it's not needed. And so there is another component. When I enable that, this is a decal, and I can solo this one out and keep spawning on top of each other, so it gets darker and darker. But it also has a lifetime of 3, so the decal stays for 3 seconds and then disappears again. The decal has a thickness. Thickness just determines how much it grows on other objects that can receive decals. So if you have a thickness of 1, it will also be 1 meter above, or like whatever the value is. Just like a normal decal, it's just spawning a normal decal. Decal, you have to just pick a material which is a decal, just an Illume shader with the decal flag set in the decal params. Just it does work with the texture too, but you don't get the full control of it. The full control you only set up in the material. As you can see, the decal is growing, so it actually grows and shrinks. You can make it move, which is quite cool actually, that you can animate decals with it and move them around and everything. And it has some random rotation on 2D axis too. So now the third component here on this projection part is there is just some smoke. And what the smoke does is it's also just like the same kind of smoke that we had in the beginning, just a bit brighter to have some look a bit more like ground color. And we spawn it in a circle. There's features in the location section. You have like positioning for where your sprites are going to spawn, in what shape. It's like, is it just like a noise, is it on geometry, on circle or box or whatever, or is it just like a random like a positional offset where you just can type in coordinates. So this one spawns in a circle, and what the locations, a lot of them have, is also they have a velocity, which is really helpful when you want something to actually just like have this opacity turned off. So they not only spawn like here, they also pick up the velocity away from the center, which is quite easy to set up this kind of shockwaves. You just set like circle, set the radius to 1, you pick some velocity, a bit of a randomizer. The axis scale here, you can squish the circle, and you can orient the circle. So if you give it another direction, the circle is like that. So it's just different orientation. It's a vector of the circle. So yeah, that's basically it. It's just like same kind of smoke. Also just have, again, velocity orientated and axis scale. And yeah, that's it. So now you have an explosion, which also leaves marks on the ground, and we can start with the last part, which is just add this thing to a box. We're gonna, yeah, this is how we do it. Okay. I'm just gonna save this one here, and I'm just gonna delete this one here, and I go into the asset browser, and I just create a new particle box. And oh no, this is not the box. This is the box, which is a very flat box for now, but we're gonna make it three-dimensional. So we delete the component, and we just add a default mesh. The RC or like the error messages just pop up. It's like, oh, yep, your component does not have a mesh applied. And you just pick here in the random mesh, you pick what mesh you want to spawn. And I have prepared my objects crate. There is one that is crate merged, and I can explain what merged means or what it doesn't. So we have the box now, but it's not moving, and we want it to be like that. Here and shoot out of the cannon. We can maybe rotate it. Let's do degrees 5. So, of course it doesn't fit. It's too big, but that's okay. So now we're just gonna add velocity to this box. And it's gonna be just directional, and it was z up, and the directional is always just like in the parent space. And which means at the moment the entity is the parent, because this one is not parented to anything. And how this velocity works here is basically you just give a vector which can be normalized but doesn't need to be normalized. It can be any value. It's like so you can have 5 to the side but also 1 forward. I usually leave this kind of to 1 and then just scale the vector. So you actually, because on the scaler you can do the modifiers, so you just have a random 0.2, so it's or 1, so it means it's not always the same speed. And now you see it has physics, and we just make gravity. Now it doesn't collide, and we can add motion collision. Now it does collide, but it looks bad. And it's because this motion collision is just a simple point collision. It's more used for sprites, and it's just checking the pivot point, basically, if the pivot point goes through something or not. It's not really actually taking the proxy of the object. It's not going through CRYENGINE or any other physics engine. It's its own. It's super cheap. You can have quite a lot of them colliding. Again, don't overdo it, of course. But yeah, it's not the one that you would use for geometry pieces. At least not for this one specifically, because this one we need to collide correctly. So we're gonna just get rid of physics and collision. Both of them needs to be turned off for this. And we're gonna add motion CRYENGINE. Now you see, when you try this for yourself, you're probably gonna see this here. Nothing happens. What you need to do is AI physics or game mode has to be enabled. So you have to press the AI physics button, enable physics or AI. If you don't have the panel here, it can be added by just right click in the panels here, and there is physics section enabled. You can also add it there. It's where you can jump in game mode and you can do the physics stuff. Now this of course doesn't look good as well, because it also has a quite a low density, and also the mesh has some properties when it's spawning, and it should not pick a random piece. We need the whole mesh. And also physics type needs to be set to mesh as well, so it actually picks the proxy. So now we can give it a bit more time to live, so we can actually watch it bounce around. You see they don't intersect with each other. That's maybe something to add later on. At the moment it's just not in. But you should also just not spawn too many meshes with this method. It's going through the physics system and doing everything, so it's if you have hundreds of these, it won't be cheap, and especially if you spawn 100 meshes. If you just set the rate here to 100, you will see the frame rate drops. Not necessarily that much here, but it does for an empty level. If you have a 1000 at least, it goes down very quick. And it has to do with the fact that every mesh that you spawn, each individual piece is a draw call, and you just get like a lot of draw calls very fast if you spawn a mesh. If you spawn a lot of meshes, which you don't get if you spawn sprites. So if you spawn like 1000 sprites in one component, it's just one draw call for 1000 sprites, and or whatever your rendering method is. If you have normal maps and everything, it's probably more. But in general, each individual sprite is not a draw call, as meshes are. So we have that. Now the only thing needs to happen is when the mesh dies, it should also explode. So what we need to do is we add second gen, and this time we don't use on spawn, we use on def. And now we can choose what we want to use on def. And what we want to use on def is, first we want the box to have spawn another mesh. And what we're going to use is we spawn the crate, and as you can see, it spawns a random piece of the crate. It's just because it's set to random piece. If I set to all pieces, it's gonna spawn. No. No, it's. I probably need also sub placement. No. It's probably because I have a rate on. I just need to count. And now you see it's actually spawning the mesh. Yeah. So the trick was I need count, not rate, and I only spawn one, but I spawn all pieces in the sub placement. I could center sub placement or like standard. This would give me all the pieces in just on the pivot point, which is not what I want. I want the pieces all to be sub-placed like they were in the original mesh. And now I just give them gravity, and they will just collapse because they don't have collision. If I give them collision, and now I'm gonna use the cheap collision. So now they're gonna collide with the pivot, and it just looks ugly. Because I actually should rotate to normal, which makes them align to the ground that they are collided with. What's missing is just some random behavior. So we just need something like velocity omnidirectional, and just give it some speed. Now you're gonna see they slide. We're gonna increase the time a bit. So you see they slide over the ground, which is not what I want. So in the collision we can set up the friction to be 1, so it actually has some friction and just stops. And we just have the elasticity to 0.3, so they kind of bounce on the ground. And now the omnidirectional could be way stronger. And what we also want is we want them to rotate, and since they are 3-dimensional, we need rotate 3D, and we don't want random angles on the beginning because they should be on this exact point where the box is. They should spawn on the same spot, but we could have just like 500 on random rotations, on random spin, so they would start spinning. But now you see at the moment the friction does not affect the spin, so we're just gonna fix that, or like hack that, by just giving them some drag. And in the drag there's how much influence you want from the level. I set it to 0, but I want the drag to be a multiplier on the rotational thing. But now you see they stop rotating way too quick. I'm gonna add a curve modifier on the drag, but I'm not going to use H or anything, because I don't know when they're going to land or when they're still moving. So I'm going to check for speed and make sure the spawn only is not on. So you're constantly checking for speed. I only want when the speed goes towards 0, so on this side, I want a lot of drag. And when they're still moving, there should be no drag. So they're still spinning, but once they are lying down on the ground and they don't have speed, they get a lot of drag, so they just they stop rotating. So now we are basically already there. We have both components, we just need to combine them. So I can just go from here and just copy these and paste them here. Takes a while. So now looking closer, you see that the box is actually intersecting with the camera when it comes out. We can, on the size, we just add curve again over H, and I think I forgot to mention the whole concept of modifiers in general, which is quite important. Modifier is just basically just multiplying the value here. It's just, you get a 1, you have whatever math you do on the curve or whatever, and then you just multiply with this number, and what you get out of it is then actually going to be the real thing. So size is going to be always 1 times the curve. So now it shoots out this thing, but it also looks way better if we actually just give it some spin. So now we are pretty much ready to just copy from the explosion and just paste it here. Let's move this one over here. Come on, get out of my. So the mesh should just spawn the explosion, and it should not have a rate, the timer. The timer should just have count. We only want one explosion. And now it does it. You see that the explosion has an offset. It's not in the center. It's just because the box has its pivot down there. And I'm actually fully aware that this box has TNT, but it's full of dynamite, and dynamite is not TNT, so just don't complain about that. So what I wanted to do is add some offset location offset on the whole thing. So if I move the parent up by just 0.25, the whole children gets moved with this parent as well. So now I shifted the whole explosion into the center of the box, and that's basically it. Here we have the original effect. This one we just recreated. Looks quite similar, of course. If you spend some more time, it looks a bit cooler here. If you spend even more time on it, it actually looks good. So yeah, that's all for creating a particle. Now I wanted to show you some attributes. You were seeing actually this box is burning. I get delete of it. How we can make the box burn is quite easy actually. We can just copy. We had the streaks with the fire following it. We just make the same fire, just paste it here next to the box, and now we see like on the mesh when it's actually spawning, and not second gen, on spawn, because we have on def here, but we don't want on spawn. So on spawn we have this tiny fire following it. You can make it a bit bigger, but it doesn't help really, because it's only spawning on one point, and also just not very much of it. We can make it a lot, but still it's just one point. What we want to do is we just want to use the geometry of the spawn location. We could set up a box, but we just go location geometry, and it will just pick from its parent whatever you choose here: surface, a volume, on the edges, which responds on the edges or on the vertices. So if you give it like 500 or something, you actually get some fire on the box when it's coming out. So now we have fire on the box, but maybe the box is not always on fire. Maybe you want like the same particle but with a variation. So usually you would, in the old one, you would just copy and paste all this stuff in one particle, and then you would just maintain two very similar particles that would share some things but not actually the same, but very similar. And if you would have to change something on one particle, you usually want also fix the other one. So it's really hard to maintain variations of particles. What we can do now is I can add attributes, and the simplest attribute would be Boolean. We can have different types: integer, float, color. Boolean is either something is on or off, and I could make fire attribute. So fire is now a variable, it can be on or off. And what I can do with this burning fire on the geometry, let me just delete this so we don't need them. I would just add where is it component enable if, and this is the simplest way to work with attributes. You basically just say enable if fire, and if fire is true, there will be fire. This component will be working. If fire is false, there will be no fire on the box, because this component only runs if there is if fire is true. So now we add the same thing, boolean, we add an explosion, and explosion is true, and we say on this timer, which is our explosion root, we just say component enable if, and as you see there was in the component enable if, there's also spawn if, where's the component spawn if, and enabled by config. We can look into these quickly, but spawn if is basically the same as enable if, but it actually, from what some code has to explain, but I think the enable if is a much deeper disable. I think spawn if can be still, when the particle is still running, like if it's continuous particle, it can still enable it, so the spawn rate just goes to 0, but enable actually just disables the whole component, so once it's started, it can't be turned on again. It's like it's not even in memory, it's not accessible. So that's the difference between spawn and enable. And enable by config is it will enable this component only if you're in a specific configuration, if you're like PS4 or something. So you can have variations of like this is my particle for consoles, and this is one for PC, and different specs. So what you can do is on a component enable if you can just have explosion here, and so I turn off explosion, and now the explosion doesn't happen anymore. Now the thing is, the box still behaves like it's exploding, so there's still the things collapsing. Maybe I want like a variation where the box doesn't explode, but it just collapses. So, but I don't want to like two variables to control this. I want only one variable to take care of this. So if I say there's no explosion, then the box should behave different. So I go into this omnidirectional velocity of the mesh pieces that are spawned from there, and I'm gonna add a curve, which is the simplest way to do this, but there is other more ways to do that. So, and on the curve, I'm gonna pick as the source, I'm gonna pick an attribute, and the attribute name is explosion. Now you think like, oh, what this, but it's boolean and you're picking float values here. Yes, it just gets converted, so the boolean is either 0, it's over here, or 1 is over there. So now if the boolean is 0, my velocity is way lower, and now the board is just collapsing. It's not really exploding anymore. I could make it 10, so it's like when it actually explodes, it explodes more. So I go back to my attributes, and I enable explosion again, and now it explodes, and you see the boards flying around. Well, 10 was too much. But yeah, you see they fly around, and if it's not exploding, the board is just collapsing. So this is a very, very powerful way of having just very little values to control. Like any of this node could have on almost any feature, you could have the modifier that picks up this attribute and changes the behavior completely. Like it could render a completely new effect just based on a value, and it's not even just like on or off. If we just say, let's say we add a float, and we gonna add, let's see what we're gonna add. Create rate, because it rhymes. So now we're just gonna use here on the mesh spawner on the rate, we're gonna just choose attribute, and we're gonna choose create rate. And we don't have a curve here or something because we don't need to really translate it. We just pick the value. It's currently 1 here. So what we get here is we have amount of 1 gets multiplied by 1. So we have still 1 per second. So if I go in the create rate here and I just ramp it up to 5, we get 5 times the second. So you don't need necessarily curve. You can have this different. Now the thing is, maybe you say, oh, when the rate is so high, I want to reduce some other counts, and you could do that. You could go into this individual parts and have another curve that would just reduce some other pieces of some parts, because maybe this is too much explosion for you and you can't handle it. So you would still have just one value, but then you don't just increase the count on everything. You just you increase and reduce at the same time to compensate. Maybe you have like a shotgun shot that spawns a lot of small particles. So you want to use the same impact effect, but you probably want to lower count, just because you spawn more individual ones. Okay, that's it, and we can quickly recap what we looked at today. That was how is Wave-equivalent PFX2 different to the old system, how you create a particle, how you create a basic or more complex explosion with all kinds of components that we have. We learned how to use modifiers, how to use attributes, how to spawn meshes, how to spawn on meshes. Yeah, that's already quite enough. Thank you for watching, and it was a pleasure to show you this, and please use it. Please use the new system. We are glad to hear feedback. So yeah, thank you and goodbye.
Achieved with CRYENGINE.